So I am really, really excited about this new series, and I got to tell you, I'm really, really nervous too, because it's a big deal what we're going to be talking about here today and over the next 2 weeks. But before we get into the content, I want to kind of set the stage this way. If you or someone you know, it's more likely that it's someone you know, and you know someone who has left the faith, who has their hand on the handle and about to open the door and walk out and say, I'm done with religion, or I'm done with Christianity. If you know someone, because of something that they read in the Bible or something that someone told them about the Bible, I want to let you know so that you can let them know that they may be leaving unnecessarily. And that's what I want to spend the next 3 weeks talking about, is how do we understand this book? How does it make sense to us? Because here's the thing. One of the key ideas in this whole series that we're starting today is Jesus' most devout followers in the first century never owned a Bible. Most of them, if they had access to anything written, they couldn't read it because they didn't have the ability to read, you know. And we need to know this, that the Bible as we know it really wasn't compiled. We didn't have it until about the 4th century, the beginning of the 4th century. So for 300 years, these people, without Scripture, these followers of Jesus changed the world. And it's because of them and their faith that we are sitting here today. But they didn't have this book. What did they have that we don't have? What do they have that we don't have? And why is it so many people today in the 21st century are so quick to walk away from faith because of a book that didn't exist when Christianity began? So I want you to think about that as we get started here. And I want to encourage you, take some notes. You're going to learn some things that you did not know when you walked in here today. I've learned some things in preparing, so just guarantee you that. And then use the study guide. Even more importantly, use the study guide. It's available out in paper copy, out in the lobby. It's also available online. So I encourage you to do that. The idea behind the study guide is to open the Bible. We are people of this book in many, many ways. So you need to open it, listen to God's voice within that book. So one of my guiding principles as a pastor is to make the gospel of Jesus accessible to people. That's what I want to do, make the gospel accessible to people. I like how Andy Stanley puts it. He says, I want to resist anything that makes the gospel resistible. I want to resist anything that makes the gospel resistible. So I've spent my entire ministry trying to eliminate obstacles to people encountering the good news of Jesus Christ. And some of that has been just practical stuff, like I've tried to eliminate churchy language from how I speak. You know, you ever been around somebody and they kind of speak Christianese or churchese, and you're like, wow. I mean, if you grew up in the church, you're like, oh yeah, they get it. You know, if you didn't grow up in the church, you're like, wow, that is a whole foreign language. Let's not speak churchy language. Just get rid of that. And some other things that I think are important. Pretending that you got it all together? No, get rid of it. It's okay. By the way, one of the core beliefs we have is it's okay to not be okay and to say that you're not okay. So get rid of that. Got to dress up for church? We got rid of that a long time ago. You know, that's not about what you wear. It's about what's going on in your heart. And as I've said before, what you wear, just cover up your bits and pieces. That's all that's important, what you wear. See, what I'm getting at is I've worked hard to make sure that the church is less detached from the real world. And part of that as a pastor has been to remove obstacles when it comes to the Bible and our understanding of the Bible. And so, really over the last 10 years or so, I've worked hard to clarify what the Bible is for us. Because for a lot of people, and to clarify what the foundation of our faith is, because for a lot of people, the foundation of their faith, a lot of Christians, the foundation of their faith is the book. It's the Bible. But the Bible doesn't even point to itself as the foundation of faith. And for lots of people, how Christians approach the Bible, how Christians talk about the Bible makes Christianity very unapproachable and makes Christianity resistible. I want to fix that. So here's what I'm talking about. I'll give you an illustration. My eyes were opened when I did a message series about 10 years ago called Conversations with an Atheist. And in that message series, I wanted to kind of really understand what modern atheism was doing, because there are these writers and authors, they're called the New Atheists, that have really gained a lot of popular attention. And I'm talking about people like Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens. So in order to get ready for the series, I bought their books and started reading a lot of those and beginning to understand where they came from. And those authors and their books got really, really popular after the events of 9/11. Why did they get really popular after 9/11? Well, they began to say, hey, because everybody was attacking Islam as the source of all this violence. They were saying, no, it's not Islam, it's all religion. And they said that religion in general is the problem, and they began to specifically attack Christianity. They began to especially attack the Old Testament as a source of the violence in our world today. And so these new atheists, I want to say, they're not bad people. They're not evil people. They just have a very, very different worldview. And they have attacked persuasively, they have attacked very credibly the morality of our Bibles and the credibility of our Bibles. And here's what I mean. They attack the credibility by saying, hey, just look at this. This isn't logical, and here's an error, here's a problem. They identify these problems in our Bibles. They attack the morality by saying that religion isn't just wrong. They say religion is bad. They say that the God of the Old Testament, to quote, is a moral monster. And listen, that atheistic message is nothing new. That's been out there for many, many, many generations. Atheists talking about that forever. But you combine that with the events of 9/11, combine that with the anti-religious sentiment that's kind of going on in our country, then combine that with the internet, the rise of social media, access to information. All that, especially about 10 years ago, was about to be exploited in a way that was threatening the faith of our next generations. It was like the perfect storm, you can put it that way, perfect storm. And the perfect storm was there because for a long time, our modern version of Christianity had an Achilles heel. And you know what Achilles heel is, right? It's a weakness that could bring it down. And that weakness had not been exploited because most people respected the Bible. And even if they didn't respect the Bible, they spoke about it respectfully, out of respect for people who respected the Bible. But that changed. It has changed. Now, when it comes to all of this and what I'm talking about right now, I'm not really concerned about you all in this room. I mean, if you're in this room, you probably, you're in some place in a faith journey, and that's important. And by the way, if you're kind of 40 and you're in your faith, you're probably going to stick with it. If you're in your 30s and you're in your faith, you're probably going to stick with that. I'm worried about the next generations. Our kids, our teenagers. Because what the church has been doing for a long time, and I mean the big church, just St. Paul's, but what the church has done is sent kids out into the world with a Sunday school faith that is not going to stand up against the onslaught that's becoming more and more prevalent in our country. But here's the good news. The good news is there is a good response to this because the Achilles heel of Christianity is actually a misapplication of the Bible. And it's a misapplication of the Bible that started about 500 years ago in the Reformation. Remember the Reformation? You remember your history real quick? The Christian world was really dominated by the Catholic Church. I mean, that's, really what faith started as. And there was a reaction against that. And this idea that happened in the Reformation came out of a reaction. It was a reaction saying the Pope is not our authority of faith. Tradition is not our authority of faith. The idea that rose out of the Reformation was this, sola scriptura in Latin, which means Scripture alone. Sola scriptura, Scripture alone, in saying that the Bible is our authority. Now, that's a good thing, right? That is a very good thing. But over time, the idea of sola scriptura began to mean that the Bible is actually the foundation of our faith. Not just the authority, but the foundation of our faith. So listen carefully. There is a difference between something being an authority for you to live by and something that's considered the foundation of your faith or your faith system. Two very important distinctions. Is it an authority or is it the foundation? And over time, those two ideas, they just kind of got merged together, kind of sort of casually in the 1500s, 1600s, 1700s, and it wasn't anybody's fault. That's just the way church leaders started talking about it. And so for many of us, by the time, being raised in the 20th century as a young adult, church leaders had begun talking about the Bible as the foundation of our faith. And phrases like this, that as the Bible goes, so goes our faith. If part of it is inaccurate, and it's the foundation of your faith, then it all comes crumbling down like a house of cards. If it's not all true, then none of it can be trusted. See, the new atheists and the anti-Christianity vibe that's going on, and the internet revolution showed how fragile that house of cards really is. But listen carefully. The Bible was not the foundation of the faith for for the first 300 years of Christianity. Now, wait a second. You're thinking, Aaron, what? If the Bible was the foundation of the faith for the first 300 years of Christianity, what was the foundation of the faith? And the answer to that question is what we're going to be talking about over the next 3 weeks. Next 3 weeks, we're going to look at what served as the foundation of the faith for those first century Christians. We're going to look at how they began to understand their Old Testament, because I'm convinced that we should take our cues about the foundation of our faith from how those first century Christians approached their faith and the Old Testament, from those men and women that were closest to the action in the first century. And when we take our cue from them, and if we can actually help our next generations take our cue from those first generation Christians, if we can help our kids and grandkids take their cue from that group, then you end up with a faith that is enduring and defensible and unassailable. It's that version of faith. It's the original version of faith. So here we go. Now, we're going to do some study of Scripture here that's really important. You might want to jot some of these Scripture references down, or grab a copy of the message out in the lobby. But I need to set a little context here. So very quickly, in a nutshell, what happened is that Jesus lived his life. He taught. He was crucified. He was dead. He was buried. He came back from the dead, and then he ascended into heaven to be with the Father. And his disciples, who were witnesses of all this after the fact, they had spent time with him after the resurrection, and after that, Jesus, he ascended. They had gathered together in Jerusalem to figure out the question that you and I would be asking too: what now? What next? So this is 7 weeks after the resurrection. They're gathered in Jerusalem, and by the way, we have 4 accounts of Jesus' life, right? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in our Bibles. They give us the account of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. And Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke, also wrote one other document that's in our Bible. It's called the Book of Acts, A-C-T-S. And Luke was this interesting guy. He was like an investigative journalist. And you can tell that from how he starts his gospel. He says, well, what I did is I interviewed everybody who knew Jesus. I looked at all their stories, everything that had been written up to that point. I did all this homework on figuring this out. So he's an investigative journalist. So not only did he write Luke, but he also wrote the Book of Acts. And the Book of Acts is a document that tells us about the first 30 years of Christianity after Jesus' resurrection. So all those events that happened there. It's a great book. Now, about 7 weeks after the resurrection, now I want to highlight this, 7 weeks after the resurrection, not 7 years, not 70 years. So what happened in people's minds is really fresh, right? So the disciples are gathered in the city of Jerusalem, and the city of Jerusalem is filled with all these guests and visitors because there's a festival going on. 7 weeks earlier, it was the festival of Passover. Now what they're looking at is it's called the festival of Pentecost, right? So the religious people have flooded into Jerusalem. The city is packed, and a huge wind blows through the city. And this wind carries with it somehow the Spirit of God that does something in the first disciples. And you can describe it in lots of different ways. They describe it as a wind, a fire that came into them, and they were able to speak in dialects that they had never spoken before. And they spill out into the street, and at this point, there aren't just 12 disciples. There are about 100 people that are calling themselves followers of Jesus. They spill out into the street from wherever this event happened. The streets are packed with people, and they begin to talk to people about Jesus, about the gospel, about the resurrection. And here's what Luke describes. The people say, the people in the crowd, they say, "How can this be? These people are from Galilee, and yet we hear them speaking in our own native languages." But others in the crowd ridiculed them, saying, "They're just drunk, that's all." I think it's hilarious. And you got to wonder, why is that in there? What is Luke? What did I describe him as a minute ago? An investigative journalist. So he's talking to people. What happened? Tell me what happened. You saw that too, and you heard that? A bunch of people said. Luke put it in there because that's what happened. And I think it's really interesting. So crowd is there. They're gathered around. Something weird is going on. And Peter loves to take moments like that to speak to people. He is just he is like the type A personality. He's that red personality, on the color code. He is that guy. And so he has an opportunity to share. So he stands up and he says, hey, fellow Jews, and all of you who live in Jerusalem, listen carefully to what I say. These people are not drunk as you suppose. It's only 9 a.m. And I know only a handful of you are drunk in here today at 9 in the morning, but it's 9, and I think that's what he wanted people to do, is laugh. He was warming up the crowd because he had something he wanted them to hear. And then he jumps right in. He says, Jesus of Nazareth was a man accredited by God to you by miracles and wonders and signs, which God did among you through him, as you yourselves know. Now, that little phrase, as you yourselves know, should jump out at us. Why should they know? Why should this crowd of people know what happened 7 weeks ago? It's because they're the same people. Because those religious people that came 7 weeks ago for Passover came back. This is what they did. It was their social life. It was everything to them. Their religious life. They came back 7 weeks later. They were the same people. They had heard about Jesus. They had seen some of the events. Some of them may have been witnesses of Jesus dragging his cross through the streets of Jerusalem. Some of them were there. As you know. And he goes on. He says, this man Jesus was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge, and you, with the help of wicked men, put him to death. He's kind of pointing at you, put him to death by nailing him to a cross. But God raised him from the dead, freeing him from the agony of death, because it was impossible for death to keep its hold on him. God has raised this Jesus to life, and we, his disciples, are witnesses of this. Now, he says a little bit more. But after he's done talking, people are convinced. They're convicted. And it says that many, many, many people chose to become followers of Jesus that day. And here's what I want us to get. The very first Christian sermon preached was not about something Jesus taught. The very first Christian sermon ever preached was about the resurrection of Jesus. Now, not long after that, so fast forward a little bit. That's one scene in the book of Acts. Fast forward a little bit. And Peter and John, two of the disciples, they go to the temple to pray. And you got to think about this in its context too. They go to the temple to pray. That is a bold move. Why is it a bold move? Because they're wanted men. Why are they wanted men? Well, as far as the Romans were concerned, they captured and killed the leader of this little group of Christ followers, the rebels. When you got the leader, you went after the followers too, because you didn't want them to continue the movement that you were trying to stop. So they're being bold. They go to the temple, and they go there to pray. And while they're walking up to the temple, there's a man who is sitting outside one of the gates of the temple begging. He's disabled. That's just where he is every day. Right there. Everybody knows him. I don't know his name. Let's call him Frank. Frank is sitting there at the gate of the temple, and everybody knows him. Everybody sees him. Morning, Frank. And Frank's, hey, you got anything you can give me today? He can't work. This is how he exists. He has to beg. So you got anything to give me? And some people say, no, I can't help you today, Frank. Maybe tomorrow. And so he knows everybody by name. Everybody knows Frank by name. His whole life. This is how he's lived. Peter and John walk in, and Frank's like, hey, you guys got anything going today? And they're like, we don't have anything. So they just healed him. We don't have any money for you. We'll just heal you. And they do. And Frank gets up. He's like, oh my God. Oh my God. God. And he starts shouting and causing a scene, and people are coming over and like, Frank? That's Frank. I've never seen him stand up before. This is Frank. And so Frank is just going crazy, going bonkers, draws a crowd around him. Peter loves a crowd, right? So Peter starts preaching again. And he says to the people that are gathered around, he says, why are you surprised by this? This Jesus you labeled as a criminal, orchestrating and killing him a couple months ago. Peter says, you killed the author of life, but God raised him from the dead. We are witnesses of this. Again, asking the question, what is Peter's foundation of faith? Where did Peter get his hope? Where did Peter get his boldness? How is it that he's walking around openly in public, openly in the temple, when just a few weeks ago, he was afraid for his life, running and hiding? Well, the foundation of his faith was not something that he had read or had read to him. The foundation of his faith was what he had, what? Seen. Now, all this with the healed man, with Frank, it causes a disturbance in the temple area, and the religious leaders did not like any disturbances, especially in the temple area, and so they had guards. They had temple guards. The job of the temple guards was to push down any disturbances and get anybody out of there that was causing trouble. And then they look over and say, okay, these aren't just anybody causing trouble. These are followers of Jesus. We know who they are. This is Peter and John. So the temple guards grab Peter and John and take them to the Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin, what's that? It's the religious Supreme Court. I mean, this is big time. It's a big deal. And Peter and John never had stood in front of the Supreme Court before. And the high priest is there. His name is Caiaphas. And Caiaphas is like the chief justice of the Supreme Court. And he is there. Oh, you got to know this too. That Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, they're the ones that orchestrated Jesus' death. Put all the pieces in play so that Jesus could be eliminated. And there's Peter and John standing in front of him. If this were a movie, you'd hear the music. Bum, bum, bum. Because the fate of Jesus is about to be their fate. Now, here's one little twist, though. There's a problem. They want to get rid of these guys just like they wanted to get rid of Jesus. They got a problem, though, because this is a court. They're having a trial, quick one, but they're witnesses. They need witnesses. Okay, who was there? Well, Frank was there. Frank's kind of the source of the disruption. Get Frank in here. And they know Frank, the people in Sanhedrin, because they walk past him too every day. They give him some money once in a while. They know Frank. And they're like, wait a second. We got a sticky situation here. Because if we punish Peter and John for what they just did in this healing miracle, that is clearly a miracle, then people are going to rise up against us. So we better think this through. And they decide they're not going to punish Peter and John, but they are going to warn them. Peter speaks up in the middle of all this. Peter speaks up because he's the one who talks all the time. He says, rulers and elders of the people, if we're being called into account today for an act of kindness shown to a man who was lame and are now being asked how he was healed, then know this. It is by the name of Jesus Christ of Nazareth, whom you crucified. He loves reminding them of that. But whom God raised from the dead. It's because of that this man stands before you healed. And again, there's their foundation of the faith. It's not something they read. It's not something they had read to them. It was the resurrection of Jesus, an event. And then notice what the court noticed that day. It says this, Luke writes, when they saw the courage of Peter and John and realized that they were unschooled, ordinary men, they were astonished, and they took note. And these men had been with Jesus. Why are they astonished at their courage? It's because everybody in that room, everybody on that court, thought that these two guys would be cowering in fear, knowing what happened to their master. Everybody in that room knew what happened to their master, and they aren't cowering at all. Why? Why? Here's why. Because when you lose your fear of death, all fear is gone. And they'd seen Jesus die. And then they encountered him resurrected. They had breakfast with him on a beach. They had conversations with him for 40 days, and then they saw him ascend to the Father. Why should they have fear? Well, the court didn't know what to do since there was a verifiable miracle right there, and they were afraid that people would rise up against them, so they just warned him. Stern warning. They said, shut up about Jesus. Zip it about the resurrection. Go back to fishing. That's what you do. Are we clear? Are we clear? You see, the foundation of their faith was powerful stuff. In the face of that warning, what did Peter and John say? Here's what they said. As for us, we cannot help but speaking about what we have heard and seen. In other words, respectfully thank you for the warning, but nothing's going to stop us from sharing the good news that we have seen, because what we saw was a resurrection. See, the foundation of the faith is not a book. The foundation of the faith is an event. In fact, one chapter later in the book of Acts, these same two guys, Peter and John, they're troublemakers. They really begin to be troublemakers. One chapter later, they're rearrested by the same group for doing the same thing, for talking about Jesus and his resurrection in the temple area. The temple guards grab them again, take them back to the Sanhedrin, and you can imagine how they felt, right? Like a parent who had told the child, don't do this again, and the child's doing it. It's like, okay, now I got to drop the hammer, right? The Sanhedrin felt the same way. Okay, we can't let this go on. They're ready to eliminate these guys. And Peter speaks up, though. He gets, has a chance again. He speaks up and he says, we must obey God. You've told us to shut up. We're not going to do it. We must obey God rather than human beings. The God of our ancestors raised Jesus from the dead. Have I told you this? Whom you killed by hanging him on a cross. We are witnesses of these things. And when the Sanhedrin heard this, they were furious and wanted to put them to death. They could have found a way to do that. They knew that they would have a PR nightmare. So instead of putting them to death, they had them flogged. And don't let that word flog just kind of fly through your brain real quick. A flogging, that means that they were stripped and whipped across their back, buttocks, and legs until their skin was flayed open. And Peter and John would bear the scars of that beating the rest of their lives. Now, remember this too. This is a time when nobody could go to a computer and look up your criminal record and say, I see you got a couple misdemeanors here, you got a parking ticket that isn't paid, and yeah, felony. Oh, you got a felony here. No, they did a different kind of background check back then. They checked your back. If you got in trouble, they would peel your clothes off and look at your back and say, yeah, oh, you are a troublemaker. You've had a problem with the law before. We know who you are. Peter and John would bear these scars forever. The scars were meant to be a symbol of shame. So what do they do after they're flogged? What do they do? It says this, Acts 5, the apostles left the Sanhedrin rejoicing because they had been counted worthy of suffering disgrace for the name. Day after day in the temple courts and from house to house, they never stopped teaching and proclaiming the good news that Jesus is the Messiah. You catch that? Catch all that? These guys are honey badgers, if you know what I mean. Even a bloody beating doesn't stop them from telling people about Jesus. They go right back to the temple day after day, after day, after day. Here's what I don't want you to miss. If you call yourself a Christian, these are our people. This is why we are here. This is how Christianity survived the first century and the second century and the third century and early into the fourth century. This is how the message of Jesus survived persecution from the temple and persecution from the empire, the Roman Empire. And there was no book. There was no the Bible. There was something else. There was fearlessness, and there was boldness, and there was courage, because God had raised a man from the dead. And when God raises a man from the dead, you listen to what that man said. And when you have met that man, you are fearless. The first century believers embraced what I want you to embrace, what I want your children to embrace, what I want your grandchildren to embrace. They embraced the first century version of our faith. They embraced the standalone version. Because now I don't need a book to prop up my faith. I don't need you to explain the creation to me to prop up my faith. The whole Noah thing, that's interesting, but that's not what props up my faith. Christianity can stand on its own two nail-scarred resurrection feet. The foundation of your faith and mine is not a book. It's an event. You need to know this too. The Bible did not create Christianity. Christianity created the Bible. And this is where we must take our stand for new generations and our generation. This is where we must stand in the misinformation age. And it's not new. This is what I'm talking about today is not new at all. It's just new to us. For the first 300 years of Christianity, this is what they knew and how they lived. So I want to end with a challenge of your imagination. And it's really going to take some work. You really got to put your imagination into high gear. What I want you to imagine is a conversation between Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris, the new atheists, right? The very convincing atheists. A conversation between those two guys and Peter. And again, these new atheists I'm talking about, they're not evil guys. They just have a very different worldview, but they think religion is the problem with the world. And how would that conversation go? So I think they'd start by giving their normal, scathing critique of the Old Testament, all things Old Testament. They'd highlight from the Old Testament God's genocidal tendencies and directives toward the ancient Jews to go into the lands that they were to possess and kill every man, woman, child, and animal that was in those lands. They would point to that. Then they would rail about the dangers of religion, and they would cite all the atrocities carried out in the name of religion, including Christianity over the centuries. In fact, in that conversation, again, using your imagination, here's some quotes from Dawkins and Harris that they might say to Peter. Dawkins might say this is one of his quotes. Peter, listen, the God of the Old Testament is arguably the most unpleasant character in all of fiction. Jealous and proud of it, a petty, unjust, unforgiving control freak, a vindictive, bloodthirsty ethnic cleanser. Sam Harris might say what he'd written. He'd say, yeah, and Peter, isn't it time that we admitted that faith is nothing more than the license religious people give one another to keep believing when reasons fail? Richard Dawkins might throw in this and say, well, to be fair, much of the Bible is not systematically evil. It's just plain weird. It's just a cleverly cobbled together group of manuscripts. And Sam Harris might add, well, the fact that my continuous and public rejection of Christianity does not worry me in the least should suggest to you just how inadequate I think your reasons for being a Christian are. Before we hear from Peter, let me ask you this. What do you do with that? Or even more importantly, what does your 19-year-old daughter do with that? What does your 21-year-old son do with that? No wonder people are reaching for the door, leaving the faith. No wonder people are walking away, not because they've read the books by these particular authors, but because this kind of thinking permeates our culture right now. Thanks to the internet, it's all one click away. Actually, I thought about that as I wrote that. One click away. It's not even one click away. It's right there before you click. And if the foundation of your faith is an absolutely true book, good luck with that in the face of this kind of onslaught. And you might not be worried sitting here today. You might be not worried and hey, I believe what I believe, and you're not going to read that stuff anyway. But good luck with your kids and grandkids. They're seeing it. But I have great news. You ready for the great news? Because I think Peter might respond this way. I think Peter would respond to Harris and Dawkins by saying, fellas, I hear you, and I'm certainly familiar with my own people's history, and I'm sure that the reason I've never questioned it is because that's just how I was raised, and I didn't know I could. But gentlemen, none of that, in fact, and nothing that you stated has anything to do with my decision to follow Jesus. Sam, you referenced the inadequacy of my reasoning, so let me explain my reasoning that I'm a follower of Jesus. Actually, it's just one reason. Peter would say, when my teacher was arrested, I ran. And when asked if I knew him, I lied. When the Romans crucified him, he died. And in that moment, I was like the two of you. I had no faith. I did not know what to believe. When the women burst into that room that first early that morning to tell us that the tomb was empty, I didn't believe it was a miracle. I'm no fool. Have you ever seen a crucifixion? Mr. Dawkins, Mr. Harris, have you ever seen a crucifixion? I've seen many of them. And no one survives a crucifixion. I assumed, like all of us did, that somebody had simply taken the body, but I was curious. I wanted to go see for myself, and before I knew it, I'll admit it, I was running, and I had hope. But guys, as John and I stared into that empty cave, we didn't know what to think. Later, Mary Magdalene found us and said that she'd found the Master alive, but I wouldn't allow myself to believe it. I wouldn't allow myself to believe it because my heart had been ripped out of my chest already. I spent 3 years of my life following this guy. Seemed now more like a false prophet, a wannabe Messiah. I was not going to spend another season of my life chasing ghosts. In fact, there was a price on my head, and if I continued chasing after him, I'd be a ghost myself. So that night, as was our habit, we went to our safe room. We found a safe house outside of town. We locked the doors. And we talked. about what we'd seen. And we cried, and we were angry, and we shared our pain about everything that had happened that day. And that's when he came. Nobody saw him walk in, and I swear to you the doors were locked, but there he was, very much alive. And fellas, I really can't argue with anything that you've said, but I would like to clarify one thing. The reason for my believing isn't something I heard, it's not something that I read or had read to me. I believe what I believe because of what I saw. I watched him die. I know where they buried him, but God raised him, and I saw him more than once. That's the reason. That's the only reason for my hope. And that is the foundation of my faith. So, ladies and gentlemen, that's the reason for your hope as well. And we will pick up the rest of the story next Sunday.